The sensible thing to do would have been to make the table to go onto those trunnions out of 2 layers of the precious Baltic birch plywood. But no, I had to use the cheap Chinese import plywood with lots of voids and thin veneer on top. So I cut my own veneer and glued that on top and put edge trimming around there. And I'm starting to wonder if this bandsaw build is going to turn into a multi-year saga like Winter Catan's Marble Machine X. But let's go back to the start of the table build. I started by ripping some thin veneer using a really thin skill saw blade, which didn't cut all the way through, so I had to use my bandsaw to cut through the middle of it. These pieces of plywood are going to be my bandsaw table, but I want the top to be a little bit harder than the veneer that's on here. So I want to glue this veneer on there, but to make sure it's nice and flat, I want to run this thin veneer through the thickness planer. I know, that's a bad idea. The planer doesn't even move the head that low, so I have to run these through on top of another board. Now if I just run that through there like that, what's very likely is the head will catch the front of the board, lift it further into the head, and just shred it to pieces. So what I'm going to try to do is to start the planer already on the workpiece. I need to start this board this far in. So I might stall the planer when I turn it on. I have to be very careful. Whoa, bad idea. So starting with the head already engaged, didn't stall the planer, but it kicked it back, so bad idea. But then I thought, okay, just start it without engaging it and then crank it down before it gets to the end. The only problem with that approach is that I don't get to plane the start of the board. But that's okay, then I'll just feed it in the other direction and do the same thing again. To get to the same depth every time, I put this clamp here, so once the planer started, I know I just have to do 2 turns really quick to get to that depth setting. And you have to make sure the wood is really straight grained. This wasn't, and even though this was feeding out, it lifted it up and just pulled it into the planer head and it was gone. I'm using a notched glue spreader meant for flooring application to get an even coat of glue on there quickly. And then my big piece of veneer on top, and then some plastic in case the glue squeezes through, and a soft pad to get even pressure. From the sound of it, I think that veneer bonded everywhere. And then gluing another layer of plywood to the other side, that is the bottom of it. And initially I clamped it on the same way with a pad and the clamping cauls. Clamping it onto the workbench bowed the workbench a little bit, so I clamped it with individual clamps instead. So there's my table. I was worried it would get warped while I was clamping it, and it does have a slight bow this way. This way it's much better, although it has a bit of a ripple. I think my veneer wasn't consistently even thickness, so I'll try to plane some of those ripples out. After that, trimming a little bit off of each edge to make sure that all the layers are flush with each other. Because I'm not using very good plywood, I'm adding some edge trim to it. I've got 2 sides glued on, now I gotta wait for the glue to dry before gluing the rest of it on. And you can see here, here's the plywood and the hardwood veneer on top. 3rd piece glued on. Once that's dry, I'll flush cut these pieces here and I can put the last piece on there. And I neglected to film gluing that last piece on, so here's trimming off the overhang. Now if I used Baltic birch plywood, I could have skipped the veneer on top and the trim around the edges, and basically I'd be at this point when I started. Now these trunnions are designed for a table that is 36 millimeters thick, and the slot there wouldn't move with respect to the blade. But my table sandwich is a little bit thicker than that, which means I have to cut a little bit off of the trunnions. I'm kind of going off the plans, just trying to figure out where I like the table in terms of where it feels comfortable. So the table insert needs to go right about here. I'm cutting the hole in the table by routing around it with a 1/4 inch router bit. I keep extending that further and further, and by the time I got through the table, that bit was extended way out of the router. By routing around it again with a larger router bit, I get this nice ledge to hold up the insert. Now with the table on it for the first time, I need to position it center of the slot there, and I need lots of room in front of the blade so I can get in and out through the slot. Not so much room behind it, as long as it doesn't hit the table before it hits the blade guides. So I'll just mark where the trunnions ended up. And then I realized I forgot to put the mounting bolts in there, so I had to take them off again and put those bolts in. So there's quite a bit that still needs carving away to make room for the blade guides and the blade as the table is tilted. Got a nice hole carved, but now I need to cut away something right here. I only filmed a few iterations of fitting and carving away and fitting, but looking at my time-lapse camera, I think it was about 10 times that I had to go back and forth to carve out more stuff before I got it to the full angle. Finally, I have that space underneath the table for the blade guides carved out enough that I can tilt the table by a full 45 degrees. Making an insert for the table is my favorite part. This saw is now functional. Next step will be the enclosure.